feel a sense of purpose with what is being used, and an actual marrying between the function of the piece and the design of the piece. Glass has been used for about 4,000 years, actually about 6,000 years. It was first found used in Egypt around 4000 BC. And basically glass is the sand that's been melted with some kind of chemicals in it, a fluxing agent, and then it will solidify. Glass was found in Egyptian tombs as early as 4000 BC. And it was mostly in the form of beads and charms, which were sold, sewn to clothing or sold as necklaces, things like that. In the more advanced civilizations before Christ, the Egyptian, Phoenician, and Greek cultures, work with glass really developed. Kilns that were developing higher temperatures were made about the year 1000 BC, and at the time of Christ, there was probably the biggest revolution in glass production at that time, and that was the Phoenicians developed the blowpipe technique of making glass. Prior to that, glass was taken from a kiln and on a gathering rod and wound around a sand or stone core. Okay, so they would take the molten glass and wrap it around, and it would form a bowl or glass depending on whatever the mold was. Well, because of the nature of glass, as it cools, you've taken a gather out and you've wound it on the core. Then to complete it, you go back to the kiln and bring out more glass. Well, this is cooled several hundred degrees by that time, and a lot of times when you put the hot glass back on it again, it would crack. It was a very inefficient form of making glass. Well, around 50 BC, the Phoenicians developed the blowpipe. And it so revolutionized the making of glass that in the years between 50 BC and 50 AD, that 100-year period, more glass was made in the area of Phoenicia than by all the previous civilizations in the preceding 4,000 years, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, etc. So you can see how much of an impact that had. Also at the same time, the Romans developed a high temperature kiln that was able to control the temperature much more effectively. They were able to maintain a constant temperature in the kiln, and what happened is they were really able to develop new ways of decorating glass. Now, what are the most common ways that glass can be decorated? Ideas? Enameling, something painted on the surface. Etching, something ground into the surface to make a design. Obviously, the form itself changes it. Color, the material that's in the glass. Press, ribbons, applied beads, decorations, and things like that. We, being the aesthetic people that we are, were never really just satisfied with a plain cup. We wanted an adorned cup. And those of us who are collectors would like 100 different adorned cups. 1,000. 1,000. Okay. We like to collect. Now, I've told this story before, but it's one of my favorites about beer stein collectors. A lot of you probably realize that, I'm going to say it was in the Library of Congress, I read the book, it was printed around 1909, a story of what makes a beer stein collector. And the story says that a beer stein collector and a very devout minister died at the exact same instant. And because of that, both of them went to heaven at the same time. St. Peter asked each of them their name, and they gave him their name, and he said, "Yes, let me show you to your eternal home." So he took the beer stein collector in, and they went through the pearly gates of heaven, gold streets, marble castles, silk tapestries, and about a block later they came upon this most opulent castle you would ever believe. Silk tapestries, choirs of angels, gold and silver, just beyond any of the wealth of any of the European kings. Well, then he takes the minister, and they start walking, and they go to the silver streets, and then to the brass, and then down to the dirt. He comes to this little tar paper shack, and St. Peter says, "This will be your eternal home." Well, the minister says, "I don't mean to sound dissatisfied," but he said, "How come the Stein collector gets that beautiful mansion, and I've spent my whole life serving people, and I only get this shack?" He said, "Well, it may seem unfair, but you have to realize, up here in heaven we have thousands of devout ministers. but he's the first beer stein collector who hasn't gone straight to hell. So those of us who are collectors have a unique perspective on things. We like form, we like function, we like utility, but we very much like aesthetics. Glass was extremely expensive during the period of the Roman civilization. Basically, well, before Roman civilization, it was basically only by royalty. The Romans produced tens and tens of thousands of different types of glass. If you're digging in the area around Trier, how many went to the museum in Trier or the one in Cologne and saw a lot of the Roman glass that was on exhibit there? I mean, they're still digging it up in the farmyards, okay? They produced thousands and thousands of pieces. But basically, they were relatively simple shapes. How many of you get Smithsonian Magazine? See the Phoenician glass that was being restored? How old was that? A couple thousand years old by the Greeks? Absolutely beautiful carved cameo work. Okay? Very, very rare. Very rare. The bulk of the pieces that were made were very utilitarian. Well, in the Dark Ages, the making of glass really subsided, and we don't see much about the history of glass until we get to the Renaissance in the 15 and 1600s. And probably the primary place where glass producing started again was in the town of Venice in the 1500s. And the glass production there was very expensive, and they basically controlled the glass market for all of Europe. Well, as they started making the glass, they realized that they had a very significant property there. So they tried to control it so that it wouldn't spread to other areas because they wanted to keep control of the business. Well, they formed guilds and unions that were licensed by the politicians and licensed by the royalty. Very much controlled. And what happened is, if you took the secrets of glass making, if you worked at a factory and you took the secrets of glass making to a new area, they would hunt you down and kill you, cut out your tongue, and go back and nail it to the door of the factory. Okay?
It makes a statement.
Okay. Behavior modification. You don't do it. Okay? And if they couldn't find you, they would take a family member and kill the family member and do the same thing. Okay? So you have to realize the kind of political controls that were on people at that time. Okay? Well, as glass started being made, people did risk it. They did leave, and they started making it in other areas. They moved up from Italy into Austria, Bohemia, up into the Saxony region of Germany. And sometimes at very great expense. Now, the glass that was being made by the Germans is basically what we know as Stein collectors. And a lot of it was called forest glass or Walden glass. And it had green or brown impurities in the glass that gave it a very nice texture, very nice color. Oftentimes there were a lot of bubbles and impurities in the glass. And if any of you have been to the Corning Museum in New York, okay, unbelievable selection of 15th, 16th, and 17th century glass. And in German, what we would see during that period were these large humpens or beakers. They were cylindrical, maybe a foot to 3 feet tall, usually enameled with the eagles or the crests of the town. A lot of them were guild tankards. In other words, the Potter's Guild or the Brewers Guild. And life in a guild was very strict in ordered society. There was a large apprenticeship system where people, if they went into manufacturing glass, you would start out with a 7 to 10 year apprentice the first couple of years. Basically, you would just be sweeping up and you would be gathering materials for the glass maker. You would not do anything yourself. Then as you spent more time there, you would learn some of the basic techniques. Maybe you would be in charge of pulling the pieces out of the kiln and handing them to the master to work on. But it was a very long, involved process to become experts in glass. And German glass actually became technically much better than the Italian glass that it was replacing. One of the reasons that glass was so important during that period was the fact that porcelain was the most valuable material that people were using for steins and tankards. Okay? Porcelain at that stage only came from the Orient. That's why we call it China. And it wasn't until 1710 when August the Strong of Saxony imprisoned the alchemist Vatker, and he, in trying to make the philosopher's stone to turn base metal into gold, discovered how to make porcelain. At first it was red porcelain or red stoneware, and because of the impurities, and then a few years later he was able to make white porcelain. Well, the production of glass in Germany was basically done to compete with the porcelain that was being imported from the Orient. So when we start seeing the glass manufacturing in Europe, we see a lot of very common shapes and styles, very indicative of the Chinese materials that were being brought in on porcelain steins, and on the faience steins that were also initially made in Italy in the 15, 16, 1700s as another competitor to the porcelain. So we see a lot of similarities in styles. Now, most of us date glass steins based on what? A date that's engraved on the lid, right? A certain style of drawing.
Type of pewter mounts.
Type of pewter mounts.
Auction prices.
Auction prices, catalogs. Okay, but there's a lot of very good ways of dating glass. And glass is one of the most easily misunderstood, I'd say, other than pewter, okay? Anybody can make a modern glass stein that will look like an earlier glass stein, okay? Anybody can take an old pewter mold and make a new pewter stein to look exactly like the old pewter, okay? Dates can be engraved on by anybody, okay? Whether done as something fraudulent or whether done as something unintentional, okay? I would give it to Mr. Manusoff, Dr. Manusoff, a stein dated 1710 because that's when his family emigrated from one country to another. Well, I'm not claiming that this stein was made in 1710, but I'm putting that date on it because that's of significance to him. Well, 100 years later, we see it and it's dated 1710, and we say, look at this, it was made in 1710. And yet we know by looking at it that it really wasn't. Well, how do we know that? Pewter mounts is one way. Shape is another way. The materials being used, the kind of glass that it is, things like that. What we have to do is play Columbo and put all of the different parts of the puzzle together. Now what I did was I made some slides here that we're going to show and talk about glass production, looking not at the subject matter of the stein. I think somebody may have jostled it. Okay, sorry. Okay, where was the glass produced that we typically collect? Is that fairly clear for people? Okay. Now, here we go down into the Italian area, down in here, coming up through the Austrian Alps, the Tyrol, okay, into Bavaria, southern Germany, okay. We see this period in the 15 and 1600s, moving up into this region, okay. We see glass being made over in Bohemia, southern Bohemia. We see it being made up in Dresden area, in Saxony, up in the Hessian area. And each of these areas had different styles of the glass that they made, different colors. And a lot of it had to do with the chemicals that were in the area. Like I said, the forest glass or the light green glass or the light tan glass, it came from the impurities of sodium and potassium in the sand in the region, okay? When they tried to make different colors of glass, what they would do would be to put different chemicals in the material. Manganese gave a purple colored glass. Cobalt gave a very deep blue glass. Very deep red glass was very difficult to produce. Does anybody know how they originally made ruby glass? Gold, okay? How many times did you have to fire glass before it would be gold? Twice, okay? The first firing with gold ruby glass, it's still clear. The second firing, without any chemical change, but the reheating, it turns a ruby color. It's very interesting. A lot of people are not aware of that, okay? So ruby glass during this period of the 1600s was the most expensive and the rarest of all the colored of glasses, okay? Typically right underneath that was cobalt glass, this very deep, intense blue. The most common glass were the clear or a little bit off clear with the light brown and light green colors. And that was the sodium or potash glass. Okay? Now, one of the ways of telling the color of glass or the material of glass now, does anybody have a black light used for detecting repairs in steins? Do you have one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get one, and I'll show you the difference. When you put a black light underneath different kinds of glass, you will see a different color. Okay, and we'll look at this later on. So this is the general area that we're talking about. This is the kind of glass, this is the areas that the glass was made for the steins that we collect. Now, I know most of you have been collecting steins for a fairly long time, but we'll just go over some of the terms. That'll be real good. We'll go over some of the terms here so that when I'm talking about some of the characteristics, we'll make sure that we're talking the same language. The thumb lift, this bridge between the thumb lift and the pin hinge is the tang. This is the hinge pin. This is the shank or rise. This is the strap. This we don't have to explain, is the handle. This is the foot rim, the body of the stein. This is the lid ring, the lid. This is the flange around here, and this is the top inlay, or in some cases would be the finial. Okay? Oftentimes glass was adorned with little beads, which were called fronts. Now, ways of dating glass. One of them, which he said earlier, which was dating the pewter. Okay? These are some of the typical thumb lifts that you'll see. In the late 1600s, we have what's sort of called a melon and nipple thumb lift. In California, it's legal to say this. Where I come from, we couldn't talk about that. This is the melon and nipple, okay? Late 1600s. As we move into the 1700s, we see a thumb lift that usually has a ridge around the center, or an equator band, along with the nipple. It's usually a large ball. Sometimes it's swirled, okay? As we get a little bit later, we see the competition between pewter makers. They wanted more ornate and more fancy pewter. That was a status symbol, okay? So we see something more elaborate like this. The swirl, the equator or the belly band, the nipple, a couple of tiers on here, okay? Plain, a little bit fancier, large and fancy. Also around 1750, this is the one that I call the AT&T logo thumb lift. It has the striations going around it. As you move into the early 1800s, you will see what's a representation of the upside down acorn, which is often a good luck symbol for Bavaria and Austria, okay? A stylized design. Then we have what's called the empire or urn, the thumb lift, okay? We see these a lot of times on Biedermeier wedding steins. It's a large urn. As we move a little bit later, we will see the post and flange thumb lift. Has a center post that comes up and a flange that moves back. The position of the thumb lift is generally right here, right around the rim, okay? Not over top of the hinge pin. In most cases in this approximately 1870 period, this is a small hinge, small diameter, and you don't see the pin coming through. So we would say that this is a small 5-ring, 5 different hinge parts, sealed hinge. Very indicative of the 1870 period. Okay? In this earlier period, we see a 5-ring hinge, but generally a larger diameter. We'll look at this on some of the steins. After about 1875, we start seeing more heavily detailed, solid thumb lifts. Generally not the open urns and balls of the early steins, but a heavy design. We'll see gargoyles, we'll see very elaborate dolphins and things like that. Very much in the period of after 1875 to 95. Well, after about 1895 to 1900, there was a big revolution in making steins, and it basically had to do with cost. Okay? The only way that a lot of the manufacturers could stay competitive was to be able to reduce the cost of their steins considerably, because you were talking about a mass competition for sales. So we see during this period a lot of very thin filigree thumb lifts, a lot of thin pewter lids. A lot of us know the lids, I mean, you can almost bend them in your hand. They're pressed out of the pewter. They're not very high quality. So we see the transition of thumb lifts and hinges. If anybody has any questions during this, please feel free to ask. This is a very rare cranberry glass stein. What do we see from here? What can we tell about the age? This is a piece that's 18th century, generally made between 1750 and 1790. Now, what characteristics does this have that's going to let us know that? Any ideas? Sealed hinge, okay. Location of the thumb lift is up here on the lid, not back here over top of the hinge, okay. A large domed lid, a little bit fancier. A large ball, has the equator band and the nipple on the top, okay. As we move down to the body of the glass stein, how can we tell this? One of the biggest characteristics is this is a flat ribbon handle, okay. They've taken a gather of glass, pulled it out quickly so it develops into a flat band, okay. It's touched here, whipped down here, and snipped off. In most cases, the length of the handle is 2/3 or more the length of the body, okay? The shape, it's a general very slight taper with a flare at the base. Now, if you look at faience steins from this period, you'll see the identical thing, okay? You'll see the flat handle, you'll see the location of the handle, the size of it, the location of the hinge and the thumb lift. In most cases, glass steins in this period had a small foot rim, usually was covered in pewter just for protection. This is very characteristic of a 1750 to a 1790 glass stein.
Is that the earliest you would see glass steins?
No, you'd start seeing, it's a good question. You would start seeing glass steins in the 1500s, okay? They're very, very rare in that period, okay? You will typically see the forest green colored glass, usually enameled, usually with a religious or a political state seal or something like that. You'll see the eagle with the different feathers representing the different branches of a particular royal family, what's called the Reichsadler Humpen, the eagle humpens. In the 15 and 1600s. But that's basically what you would see. They would have the characteristics of the flat ribbon handle. Oftentimes they were bulbous and coming back in, and most of the time they were enameled decoration.
But the humpen don't have pewter mounts.
No, the humpen have no lids generally during that period. If it did have a lid, it was a glass set-on lid that would go down on top of it. But I'm talking about steins, did have the pewter lids on them, or silver lids a lot of times.
So about 1750 though, with pewter mounts is about the earliest you'd expect?
Now you will see some with pewter mounts in the late 1500s and 1600s, okay? But the bulk of them, you don't see glass until you get to the mid 1700s. But if you go to the Corning Museum or you go to some good museums in Germany, you'll see glass from the 1600s and late 1500s. But it's, again, very, very rare. Now this is a piece, this is dated in the etching here, 1756, okay? Let's again look at some of the characteristics. The position of the thumb lift, the shape of the thumb lift, the flat ribbon handle going more than 2/3 of the length of the body, the flare at the base with a pewter base rim. Now this particular piece was made in Bohemia. It's dated 1756. It's soda lime glass, and it was etched with a diamond stylus and a copper wheel. The diamond stylus gave very fine etching. The copper wheel was often used with an abrasive like sand and gave sort of a matte finish to the etching. Okay? A lot of times you will see in coats of arms, like the background of this shield is in the copper wheel. It's a matte finish, okay? Then the design would be cut in with the diamond wheel, which would be clear. So it's almost like looking through a window to see that. Very nice piece. Let's get a little bit later. Okay? This is what we would call a Biedermeier wedding stein. Okay? This was made generally in the period of about 1815 to 1850. Notice some big changes in the shape. Very exaggerated shaping at the base and a real wide flare, as opposed to the 1700s where this would have come down straighter. You'll still see the thumb lift generally up here on the lid. You'll see generally a 5-ring sealed hinge. You'll see a flat ribbon handle. Very characteristic of this period. It was made in the Tyrolean area, the Alps, and Austria. Oftentimes they're enameled, usually on both the inside of the glass and the outside of the glass. This is very characteristic. Well, we're going to get a little bit later here. This is a period of 1830 to 1860. What do we start seeing as some of the changes? As opposed to a stylized shape, this is generally a straight-sided, slightly tapered body. Okay? We have, instead of a flat ribbon, it's a half round handle. It's flat on the inside and rounded on the outside. Again, it's generally 2/3 or more the length of the body. Very often these were made that did not have pewter foot rims, and there's no flange. Okay? A lot of times they were made with the pewter, but because they did not have much in substance in the way of a flange, the pewter has come off. Again, we still see the position of the thumb lift differently. We still see the 5-ring sealed hinge in its characteristic location. This is in a period of the mid-1800s, okay? Has a modified urn thumb lift. It has a 5-ring sealed hinge, fancy swirled lid. This is etched with a copper wheel. It has a flat ribbon handle, a slight flare at the base. Now, why do we say this is different from the Biedermeier wedding stein? Similarities in the handle, but the sides are straight to the base as opposed to the exaggerated hourglass of the Biedermeier stein. So this is a mid-1800s piece. It's very nicely done. It was matte wheel engraved with a copper wheel, mid-1800s. Nice green glass stein. When was this made? Gene, when was it?
1875.
1874, almost, right. Now, this is about 1850 period, again, mid-1800s. Straight tapered body, sides, a rosette that's impressed into the base, usually with a metal flower. It's just pressed right in there. This covers up the pontil, the mark on the bottom. Can you see it? Okay. This is a flat, half-round handle. Same location for the thumb lift up here. 5-ring sealed hinge. This is a small urn thumb lift as opposed to the large Biedermeier large urn. Oftentimes these were clear or were enameled, usually with floral or folk art scenes, especially the ones coming from the Tyrolean area, had very nice folk art floral designs. We're going to move a little bit later. This is a stein that's characteristic of about 1870. Okay? Again, how do we say that? This is what we would call a pole glass. Its height is very much longer than its width, proportionally. So it's a very tall, slender cylinder, straight-sided sides. Okay? Generally, if you took a cross section of the handle is round, not the half round of the early 1800s and not the flat strap of the 1700s. This is entirely round. It's generally less than half the length of the body, oftentimes even as small as 1/3 the length of the body. Okay? We have a small 5-ring sealed hinge. We have a glass inlay, and we have the post and flange thumb lift. This is absolutely characteristic of a period of 1870. And you start seeing the end of it in the 1880s. You'll see this in clear glass with no decoration. Oftentimes you'll see it in etched or cut wheel designs, sometimes with ruby or staining or different color stains on it to give a geometric design that's then cut back again with the copper wheel. Here we're going into 1890 period, 1880 to about 1895. The bell-shaped base, this is usually a fairly thick, heavy glass base. The bases on the steins of the 1700s were very thin. If you hold them up to the light, they're generally about the same thickness as the body of the stein. As you move into the 1800s, you start seeing much thicker body, or much thicker glass on the bottom of the stein than you do on the body of the stein. It's even more accentuated in this period here. Okay? Again, if you did a cross-section of the handle, it would be round shaped, generally half the length of the body or less. Now notice that the position of the thumb lift here is going back over the hinge. Okay? And usually the hinge pin shows through. Now there's some logical reasons for this besides aesthetics. We get into, in this area, we get into some heavier quality pewter that made it much easier to position the thumb lift out here because there was less chance of tearing this. Originally, one of the main reasons that the thumb lift was over here on the lid was just structural. It was easier to hold that way and it didn't bend or break off as easily. Okay? As they get to better quality, heavier pewter in the late 1800s, they moved the position of the thumb lift out over here, which actually made it a lot easier to use and drink with. Okay, characteristics. 1850 to 1880 on here. Pedestal base, cut design on the base, cut design here on the body bands. We have a half round handle. It's flat on the inside, round on the outside. Okay? Do a cross section, that's what the handle is going to look like. But the position of the thumb lift is back over here. Okay? This has a glass insert for a lid. This is characteristic of a period of 1880 to about 1900. It has the glass rope design added to the foot, and these glass beads or prunts. And most everybody knows why the prunts were placed on glass. In the 15 and 1600s, because glass was so expensive, these little beads were put on to keep the glass from slipping out of your hand. Okay? Well, in the late 1800s, in the period that the Germans call Historismus, the historicism, what they did is they used a lot of the characteristics of Renaissance glass and Croissants and Saxons and things like that, and copied those steins again, but this time basically just for decoration and ornamentation. So these applied rosettes are called prunts. Okay? This has a very large rise or shank between the strap here and the hinge. Thumb lift is positioned over top of the hinge. You'll see the hinge pin come through. This particular piece is, these lines indicate that it was fluted on the inside of the glass. And I'm pretty sure we'll see a couple over there where the fluting, if you hold it up to the light, is on the inside rather than the outside. And that's very difficult when you're blowing glass. Characteristic about 1890. Handle length less than half the length of the glass, round, tall rise, thumb lift over top of the pewter, exposed pin hinge, and this has a pewter base mount. It's fluted on the inside.
John, is there any reason why the pins were exposed later on, whereas they were closed earlier? Is there any logic for that?
As far as I know, it was just aesthetic style, and it made it easier. It was easier to make the hinge with the pin showing through. They could put it in there. but first it was done as aesthetics. And anybody, let's see, you've worked with pewter, I'm sure, Frank, haven't you, in addition to silver? Well, just in casting silver, if you made a silver lid, what's the most difficult part to make on it?
The hinges are the time consuming. Everything's got to match perfectly, and then you've got to put your pin in, and it's delicate, tedious work.
And, I mean, if you're going to make a stein, I don't think I'm exaggerating that the time that it would take to do all of the rest of it, of the lid, is probably less than it would take to do the hinge and have it come out right. It's a difficult process, okay. Now, what do we have here? Let's go back a little bit in time. This is a piece that was made approximately 1740. Okay? What were the characteristics that we looked for during this period? Okay? The handle covering 2/3 or more the length of the body. It's a flat ribbon. It's a sealed 5-ring hinge. The thumb lift is up here on the rim of the lid. Has basically a tapered body with a slight flaring at the base. This is cut in a geometric design with a diamond wheel. All these are little cups on here, which when looked at together form a very nice symmetrical pattern. When was this made? Late 1700s. Okay. Slight flare at the base, flat ribbon handle, the large ball thumb lift with the equator in the nipple, the 5-ring sealed hinge, and etched design. This particular piece was made in southern Germany. It's matte wheel etched, and it's dated 1793 on the glass body. What about this? Same basic period, exactly. Characteristic shape, flat handle, sealed hinge, location of the thumb lift. This particular one is an occupational for a mill wheelwright, and it's dated 1793. This is all enameled design. There's no etching or engraving on it. All the decoration is in polychrome enamel. A fancy swirled pewter lid.
Are they reproducing stuff like that with all those features though?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And Werner Somm's company is making it too. Okay, now when was this stein made? 1806. Guys are fantastic. Okay. This has a set-on lid. There's no pewter mounts. This lid lifts off. You set it on table. Okay. This is soda lime glass, and it's been etched with a copper wheel. It has the flat ribbon handle. It still has the same characteristic shape. Now, this particular piece probably has 20 to 25 separate facets on it. Can you see these? Each of these are about 1/2 of an inch or less going across here. It's blown as a round cylinder, okay? But before they do the etching, they grind each of these facets with a diamond wheel, okay? Then after each of those facets is done, so you have all of the sides are ground unless you get close to the handle, then they come back with the copper wheel and they etch the design in it, okay? Now if you look at these, it's really almost impossible to believe that it's done that way, okay? In looking at it, you don't see on here the divisions between each of those little facets. And that's very difficult if you're an artist and you're making a design on something that changes shape to keep this in context and perspective. So this person was a very good quality glass worker or glass engraver to be able to do that. I've got one of these in my own collection. I think it's dated 1789, and I would say it's technically not as good as this because you do see the little bumps as you go across each of these facets.
Is there a period associated with the set-on
Uh,
lids, or is that a long period?
It's a very long period of time now. You start seeing the set-on lids in the Humpins, which are the late 15 and 1600s. You see it copied again in the late 1800s, especially in what we would call Leahy steins. A lot of the overlay glass or cased crystal, which is 2 or 3 layers of glass, where they'll blow the clear glass and then they let it cool, and that's dipped back down into a layer of white glass, and then that's cooled and dipped back down into a layer of blue glass. So you've got several layers of glass. And then they will grind the colored glass back to the clear. Okay? A lot of those steins in the mid-1800s have set-on lids, 1840 to 1860. Judy got one for me for a Christmas present over in Germany. And I think it was, what, 1845, something like that, it was dated. Very characteristic. And also have some that are in the 1890s with the set-on lids. Now, a lot of us as stein collectors don't like them because other people will come to our house and pick them up, and we're afraid the lids go off. So most of them have our lids taped on. But I've got 5 or 6 because I just happen to like the glass and the fact that it doesn't have the pewter mounts. To me, that doesn't change anything. That's the way the stein was made. Okay. When was this made?
1750.
No. Early 18s, 1813 on here. This we start seeing is the Biedermeier wedding stein. Okay? This is an early version, very large with an accentuated flared base, not as much as a little bit later. It still has the flat ribbon handle covering more than 2/3 the length of the body. The thumb lift is here where the finial ordinarily would be, and it has a sealed 5-ring hinge. Now this is enameled in a folk art pattern. I think it has an occupational and a saying for good fortune to a marriage. This was made in Eastern Bohemia, 1813.
The earlier ones had a pedestal base. Did that come in later? Or
Yeah,
that's
generally the
not where
pedestal.
they-
Yeah, generally the pedestal. You start seeing 1860 or later period, and we'll look at a couple steins over here that have that. Okay, now we're not going to ask questions on this because this is sort of an out of character thing. This is a 1600s piece. This was made between 1670 and 1690 in Bohemia, but you'll still see some of the characteristics of the flat ribbon handle, the length of the handle in proportion to the body, and the location of the thumb lift. So this is a 1600s piece. This is copper wheel engraved and has some enameling on it. Has very nice pewter mounts. Now, a lot of times, like I said, glass during this period was very expensive. And so oftentimes on your very fine glass, these will have silver lids and silver mounts, and oftentimes even a silver foot rim. Now this is clear glass. You will also see, like I said, during that same period, the ruby glass, which was the most valuable and the most difficult to produce, and the cobalt, and then the off-green color, or the light colors of the light green and light brown from the sodium and potassium.
That's in the shape of a fence. They call it pear.
Yeah,
pear shape.
Birnenkrug, yeah.
Birnenkrug.
Right, with a pear-shaped jug. This is another 1700s piece. This is 1750 to 1775 Bohemia. It has a sealed 5-ring hinge. Again, the flat ribbon handle. Position of the thumb lift, very characteristic thumb lift for the second half of the 1700s. And this is soda lime glass. This is etched with a copper wheel. I've actually seen the stein, and it's incomprehensible, the amount of detail in here. You can see that this is a matte finish. Each of these windows in the house you can look through. The same as if you're looking at a house, you'll see the clear window inside. Okay. The thing that's most amazing is on the other side, it has a forest scene, okay, which is seen in reverse on the glass. So if you look through these tiny windows, it's like looking out the window into the forest, which is on the other side of the glass. I mean, it's just the technical skill and the artistry are just, it's impossible to even conceive doing that and having it turn out so well. But it's a fantastic piece. This is a mid-1700s piece, characteristic locations, hinge, strap handle, and cut decoration, and a flared base rim. I hope that information is helpful to you. And what I'd like to do is to spend a few minutes showing some live steins here. And let's talk about some of the characteristics. We don't have any 1700s glass here, so we'll start with this. What is this? Biedermeier wedding stein. Characteristics: a flat strap handle, a sealed 5-ring hinge, no pin showing through. The thumb lift, which is the hop spud, is up here on the lid where the finial ordinarily would be, but it would either be here as an urn or up here. Now this is double wall enamel, okay? It's enameled on the outside of the glass, and it's enameled on the inside of the glass, okay? A lot of people are not aware of that. What this does is it gives it a depth of field. Almost always in this band roll is a saying that's usually written in gold. Now, very often the gold was put on last, it's cold fired, so the gold will have worn off. But you can still see some of the writing on here. But by having it be double wall enamel, it gives it a softness and depth of field that you wouldn't see if it were just enameled on the surface. Characteristic shape and style. This is one of my favorite pieces that Gene and Pat have. This is 1820 to 1840. This is cobalt glass. It's straight sides. It is a flat strap handle. This has a stamped pewter lid that's very characteristic of the town of Schresheim. And there's a faience stein on the table there that has a lid from the same factory. You'll see this flat stamped design on here. It's very characteristic of this town. You see the lion thumb lift. Very often this will have a dove or kissing doves, 2 doves together kissing for a thumb lift, or a dog, or a bird, okay, or an eagle. They're very fancy pewter. This has a very nice little detail. If you'll notice the hinge here, can you see the engravings going across the hinge? Okay. This gives it a serrated or gear effect. Can you see the lines going across there? Resembles a gate hinge with the lines going across. Okay. Again, it was a little extra touch done by the pewterer to show his proficiency. There's a design on each side of the lion's footrest here. Again, nothing that was required. It was his little touch, a little bit of extra, usually in a stamped design. This is enameled with raised white enameling. It also has a written gold saying in here, about half of which is written off. Let's see if we get enough light. This really needs to be in a lit glass case to see. We already turned it up. That's fine. See how intense that blue is? Can you see that?
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is the one that you're giving me for giving the talk.
Good hit.
You got it. It's yours. Its price just went up $100.
Okay. Here we see right after the Biedermeier period. This is about 1840 to 1860. We see it's still a flare at the base. It's a half round handle. It's flat on the inside, round on the outside. It's a large 5-ring sealed hinge. This has the small or modified urn thumb lift, as opposed to the large urn that you would typically see on the Biedermeier steins. Okay? Now this is stained glass. What they did is, after this overall design was made, what they did is they painted chemicals on these little squares, and it was refired, okay? Then they grind the glass. The deep cut glass is done with a diamond wheel. All of this is done with a diamond wheel, okay? The matte glass is done with a copper wheel, and it gives it that flat matte finish. So what they've done is they've ground each of these three different colors, the manganese, the ruby, and the light blue, okay, which was chemicals that were painted on. Now this actually becomes part of the surface. It's a chemical change that goes on at the surface. It's not applied on top of it like enameling would be, okay? And that's what makes the design. Now remember what I was saying about looking through some of the windows in that house, looking through, you will see in here that in these urns, there's clear portholes to look through the matte finish, okay? You didn't know that either? Okay. Very nice piece. Star cut base, ribbed cut foot rib. Remember what I was saying about a thicker and heavier base as you get into this period?
Is the glass staining permanent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. And you'd have to remove it either with acid or engraving, something that would take it away. And this is different from the case crystal or overlay glass, which is actually a separate layer of glass on top of it. Okay. Now we move into, we'll move into characteristic 1870 period. Has the glass inlay in the pewter lid. It has the post and flange thumb lift. It has this tiny, small diameter, 5-ring sealed hinge. Okay. It has the half round handle with the flat inside, the round outside. Okay. Now this is rolled in glass frit, okay, which is little powdered glass. It's rolled in it. That gives it this blue, pearly texture. Okay. And then they grind that back to the clear with these windows in a nice geometric design. They've added to that, which is mostly worn off here, there's a gold ring inside each of those windows, again, just for decoration. But it's very characteristic of an 1870 glass that would be a lot of times either ruby stained or green stained. This is even scarcer than that with the blue glass frit.
Is that more expensive than the
Yes.
staining process?
Mhm. Yes, it is.
How can you tell that from the case glass?
It's real easy, okay? You will look in the body, there's places where it isn't covered all the way. You can see clear places, okay?
Okay.
If it's cased, it'll
It'll be
entirely
solid.
cover the thing, okay? One of the ways of telling stained glass from case glass, and I'm sorry we don't have one to show you, is if you look at it and turn it on its edge, you will see a tiny thickness of the outer glass, a 1/16th or 32nd of an inch, okay? On stained glass, you'll never see it because there's no thickness to it. It is part of the surface. It is not added on top of the surface. We'll go to another stained piece. This is 1870 glass. The lid is written all over. It's dated 1867. Okay. It's cut base. The ruby stain is painted on. Okay. Then this is cut with a diamond wheel. These deep cuts and the clear cuts here. The matte cuts are done with the copper wheel. Now, another way of telling the stain versus the overlay or the case glass is you'll see here there's wear at the base, okay? You're not going to see that on case glass. It'll be chips. If you see through it, it will have to have been chipped, whereas this can actually just wear from rubbing. It's very common on the bottom of stained glass time to see the wear.
Price of my glass just went up.
Yep. Okay.
I told
Here
her not to buy them.
Here we have a transition glass piece, okay? This is in the period of 1860 to 1880, okay? So it has characteristics of two different periods. It has the long characteristic shape of the early 1800s glass the half round handle, flat on the inside, round on the outside, but it has an open pin, okay? It's a 3-ring hinge with an open pin coming through, okay? If you saw this with a sealed hinge, I'll move back in front of that, sorry. If you see this with a sealed hinge, 5-ring hinge, and the location of the thumb lift, you could say that it would be an earlier piece. So, like I said, putting all the different parts together. This still has slightly polished pontil on the base as opposed to a smooth ground off pontil that you'll see in the 1800s pieces. Now we'll look at some of the pedestal base. This is amber luster. It's a little bit unusual in the fact that it's clear on the top, the amber luster's on the bottom. Most of the time you see an amber luster covers the entire body. So this is a shaded amber luster. Okay? It's glass enameled with the gold and red decoration put on later. Characteristic handle less than half the length of the body, the position of the thumb lift over top of the hinge. It's a 3-ring hinge versus a 5-ring hinge. We're talking the period here, 1885 to about 1900. Very nice piece.
What was the chemical used for amber?
I don't really know, to be honest with you, what they used. I know that they had some ores that they had uranium that actually they used to give an iridescence to it, but I don't know what the amber luster was on it. Okay. Clear glass from the same period. Okay? Size of the handle, shape of the handle, the large pedestal base. Now this has been etched with a diamond wheel, which gives it a clear, smooth cutting. Has a large rise, the fancy pewter thumb lift. It's a 3-ring hinge, pin showing through, 1880, 1890 period. Very nice piece.
Are all these German pieces?
Yeah, basically all these are German. This would come more from the south, the Austrian, Tyrolean area, as this is close to Schresheim. The bulk of the other is Bohemian German. Okay. What are these called?
Fronts.
Fronts, yeah, okay. Fluted. Can you see the melon flutes? Okay. They're not on the outside, they're on the inside. And that's real tough when you blow glass to do that. Very nice piece. 1880 to 1900.
Is this the first time you see bands see flutes, things like that? Or?
Basically, that's the first time you see flutes on the inside. Most of the time before that, it's ground on the outside. This has, again, a stylized upside down acorn, which is a good luck symbol for the finium. Now, look at two pieces that have basically the same shape. This is free blown or mouth blown glass. Has a thick pedestal base. The handle is attached here and pulled down. Amber luster, enamel decoration. Okay. Mouth blown glass. Same generic shape, mold blown glass. You'll notice on here, there's seams. It's a 3-part mold. You'll see a seam coming up, starting right here on the base, coming up this line, a seam right here, coming up the back where the handle is, a seam right here, okay? So this was blown into a 3-part iron mold, mouth blown. The glass was allowed to sag, dipped into the mold, they close the mold, they blow a little bit, it presses it out, they release the mold. Okay. This was a shortcut to doing it all by hand. What we see now, except in some of the better glass places, is that these are mold blown are actually done by machines where they inject air by mechanically right into the mold at a set temperature and a set pressure. Later this was enameled to give it some color.
Is that factory markings?
Most of these don't. A lot of times you'll see an SG and a crown underneath a lot of the pressed glass pieces from this period, and it was Saxon glass, okay? But most of the time, you do not see any mold marks. Occasionally, on this kind of stein here, underneath the handle, right in here, you will see enameled a few initials of the enameler. Generally not the person who made the glass, but the person who did the enameling on the glass. Nice aqua colored glass, mouth blown, fluted on the inside, pewter overlay. The handle is pewter. This is put on separately after the stein is made. This is probably 1880 to 1900 vintage. It's a nice attractive piece. Now here we have something which I feel is a replaced lid on a stein. Okay? The lid is a student society. It's dated on the inside 1872. Okay? What we see on the handle here is this is almost a round glob handle. It's attached at the base and moved to the top as opposed to being attached at the top and pulled off at the bottom. Typically you didn't start seeing this until you get between 1895 and 1910. Okay? Now it's fluted on the inside. It has the nice glass beading on here for decoration. There is an off chance that it could be early, but it has a characteristic half-liter mark and etching. The shape of the handle is not consistent with the date that's on the lid. Okay? So what we would probably say is this lid was replaced at some time, and it was done very well by somebody who knows pewter because it's a nice job on the piece. But by looking at the different parts, you'd see a major inconsistency.
You look at the thick part of the handle to see where it was first attached, and that's different than the others. Doctor, have a demonstration.
I don't know if it'll be clear enough to you. This is where it's attached in most of the steins, okay? The top part of the handle is attached first. It's pulled off at the bottom, okay? This is attached at the bottom and pulled to the top.
What tells you that?
The thickness and diameter here, Bob, if you take a...
Yeah, I see. Much different.
Okay, now, see how that's pushed off there?
Yeah.
Okay, that would not be if this was the first part, okay? It forms a straight attachment on the first. This is snipping it off on the bottom, so, okay. If the other way around, you'd see the glob would be here, and the grinding off part, this part would be at the bottom. Okay. It's a subtle thing, but maybe you can come up afterwards and just look at the base of this and the way this is pulled off, and the base of this, the way this is pulled off, and you'll be able to tell the different attachments, where it started, where it stopped. Again, attached at the bottom, pulled off at the top. This is thread glass. This is made two different ways, okay? Sometimes this is made by winding a glass thread around the body of a stein, okay? Very carefully. Most of the times it's made by etching with a needle, okay? This is unusual because it's an applied thread rather than an engraved thread. So this is the more costly way of doing this. You can actually see where the thread starts right there.
Is that a silver loop?
No, it might be even a nickel plated. If you look at the inside.
Oh, yeah. I was looking
This is brass, it looks like on the bottom.
Are there some-
It's not a Metlock, so I don't know.
Are there some fantastically rare pieces?
Oh yeah, there's
Soft?
glass pieces, and I didn't want to bring anything with me 3,000 miles on the plane. but you'll see a lot of pieces from the 16 and 1700s. There's a lattice glass that's Italian. There's some at the Corning Museum in New York. It's a beautiful crisscross lattice, okay? And a piece just sold at Christie's in London for $70,000. I don't have any, okay? We see this is the applied glass ribbon on the base, okay? Just a decorative addition. It's fluted on the inside. You can see the size of the handle. It starts here, ends here. Place of the thumb lift, the hinge, the rings. This is typically an 1880 to 1900 piece. Really nice with enameling.
Kiss that one goodbye. Notice where he put it.
Okay. This is another piece. This is generally 1900 vintage. We see the large glob of glass starting at the bottom, moved up to the top, pinched off at the top. Nice enameling.
Never see that bottom attachment before about 1880 though.
Generally you don't. Okay. Or when you do see a bottom attachment on a flat ribbon handle sometimes, okay, at the bottom, it'll curve, it'll be a C-shaped handle as opposed to swirling down. In other words, it'll be in here and in here. Okay, but you don't see this globular glass attachment at the bottom until you get to the turn of the century. Okay. Well, that's basically all of the information that I have. I hope it was helpful to you. I hope that all of you will be interested in a little bit more in your glass steins. Oh, da-da-da-da-da. We will try without ever seeing. Turn that off. Maybe can we turn one of the backlights off too? Sure. Now, typically, do you have any lead crystal goblets or anything?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
No, I do. Wait, hold on.
Whoa.
Okay, now, there's basically three kinds of glass that you will typically see, okay? We will see lead crystal, which was not used in large quantity until the late, I would say 1840 or later. You'll see the soda lime or the potash crystal that was made starting in the 15 and 1600s. The more sodium you see, the more yellow the glass. The more green you see, the more potash or potassium in the glass. The blue or clearer that you see, the more lead that's in a glass. Okay? So, now, without any hesitation, we can say that this is lead crystal, and this is a potash crystal. Would you pass me a couple more? Go with, yeah. Go with this. We'll try this, and maybe pull that one over too. Okay. We haven't practiced this, so we don't know what we're going to find. Okay? Here we probably have a soda glass. We'll just drop them, Gene, don't worry.
So does soda lime.
Soda lime and potash, most likely.
Whoa.
Gotta wash that one.
Now, the law of averages. If you see something that's a lead crystal stein with this test, okay, you can almost always assume that it was made after 1840 and most likely after 1870. Okay, they can still make the soda lime and potash lime glass today. So it's sort of like a paternity suit. It's easier to prove that it isn't something than it is something, okay? So most of the glass that you'll see from the 16 and 1700s, if you put it under a black light, this is what you'll see. But the same glass techniques can be made today. Most of the hysterismus pieces, the enameled glass at the turn of the century that copies the Renaissance pieces, will still be soda lime glass and potash glass. So you cannot use it as a definitive. although it's easier to prove if it is the lead crystal that it was made after the 1840s. That's it, gang. Thank you very much.